They didn't just laugh at me, they laughed at everything I stood for as a father. I used to tell myself that people's opinions didn't matter, that the world couldn't hurt me as long as my son smiled when I came home at night. But that was before the mornings began to feel like trials, before the simple act of dropping my child off at school turned into a silent walk of shame that everyone in town seemed eager to witness. I live in a small town where everyone knows everyone else, where appearances are everything, and where struggling fathers like me are treated like unwelcome reminders of failure. Every morning, I drove my son to school in a car so old that the engine coughed louder than I did, its paint faded, its seat covers torn, its air conditioner long dead. The other parents would pull up beside me in polished SUVs and shiny sedans, their windows tinted just enough to hide the smirks I knew were there. My son, 8 years old, would sit beside me in silence, his little backpack pressed tightly against his chest, his eyes staring at the floorboard as if avoiding the sight of our reflection in their spotless vehicles might make it all go away. I'd try to lighten the mood with a joke, something small, something that might make him smile, but his laugh was fading, replaced by the kind of quiet that only children who feel shame too early can understand. When I parked in front of the school, I always made sure to turn off the car quickly so the screeching brakes wouldn't draw attention. But it never worked. The sound echoed through the parking lot like a dying whistle, followed by the muffled laughter of people pretending to check their phones. I would open the door, step out, and feel every pair of eyes lock onto me. It wasn't just laughter. It was the kind that cut deep, the kind that came from people who believed they were better than you simply because life hadn't hit them as hard yet. They saw my worn-out clothes, my grease-stained hands, and they assumed things. That I was lazy, that I had made poor choices, that maybe my wife had left me because I couldn't provide. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew that my wife had died 3 years ago, taken by a car accident on a rainy night that I still replay in my head every time thunder rolls. They didn't know how many nights I had slept on the floor beside my son's bed just to make him feel safe, or how many hours I worked behind the scenes just to keep a roof above us. All they saw was a man who didn't belong in their perfect, polished world. Sometimes one of the parents, usually a mother with manicured nails and a tone coated in sugar, would call out, "Morning, Ethan," in a voice so falsely cheerful it made my stomach twist. They'd smile for a second, then turn to whisper as soon as I walked away. I pretended not to notice, focusing instead on my son's little hand clutching mine. That hand was the only thing that made those mornings bearable. Inside, the laughter followed me. Teachers offered me that polite pity smile that people reserve for the hopeless, and other kids would giggle as my son waved goodbye. I could feel his embarrassment, though he tried to hide it. Children have a way of absorbing the cruelty of adults without fully understanding it. I'd walk back to the car slowly, dragging my feet against the cracked pavement, pretending to look for my keys just to delay getting in. Every time I sat behind that wheel, the air felt heavier, the silence thicker. I told myself it didn't matter, that as long as I could feed him, clothe him, and keep him warm, the rest was noise. But even lies told in good faith begin to sound hollow when repeated too often. One morning stands out more vividly than the rest. It was a Tuesday, I think. The air smelled like wet asphalt, and the clouds hung low, promising rain that never came. I had just pulled into the lot when I saw a group of parents standing near the gate. They weren't even trying to hide their laughter that day. I could hear them clearly. One of them joked about how my car was probably older than the school itself. Another said, he should focus on getting a real job instead of pretending to be a hero. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced a smile for my son's sake. "Go on, buddy," I said softly, trying to sound upbeat. "You'll be late." He nodded but didn't move. He just sat there, staring out the window at the laughing parents, his eyes starting to water. "Dad," he whispered, Why do they laugh at us? I froze. I wanted to say something wise, something that would make him understand without breaking his heart. But all I managed was a whisper. Because some people forget what it means to be kind? He nodded, opened the door, and stepped out. I watched him walk toward the building with his head down, the sound of laughter chasing him like a shadow. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a kind of anger that burned behind my ribs, not at them, but at myself. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe they were right, that maybe I wasn't enough. When I got home that day, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. My hair had thinned, dark circles framed my eyes, and my face looked older than my years. The reflection didn't show failure. It showed fatigue, sacrifice, and quiet despair. But people never see that side. They see the surface and build stories around it, stories that hurt. The following morning, the same group of parents was waiting near the drop-off area again, their phones out this time. I didn't pay attention. I just wanted to get my son inside quickly and leave. But when I turned to walk back, I heard a woman's laughter, sharp, cutting, unmistakable. I looked up and saw one of them holding her phone toward me, her lips curled in amusement. She whispered something to the others, and they burst out laughing. I didn't confront them. I couldn't. Not with my son watching from the classroom window. Instead, I got into my car and sat there for a while, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. That laughter echoed inside the vehicle like a cruel melody. Eventually, I drove off, trying to drown the noise with the sound of the engine. But even that old machine couldn't mask the humiliation. That night, after putting my son to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, scrolling through my phone. My hands froze when I saw it, a video that had already gathered thousands of views. The title read, "The World's Saddest Dad." It was me. My face, my car, my tired smile captured and mocked for the world to see. The comments beneath were worse than the laughter. Strangers debating my worth, joking about my car, mocking the way I dressed, calling me a man who gave up. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling something inside me break. Not anger, not even shame, but something deeper. I thought about my son, about how this would reach him, about how tomorrow morning wouldn't just be another day of judgment, it would be public humiliation. And in that moment, I realized something painful and irreversible. I was no longer just a struggling father in a small town. I was now the face of mockery for the entire world. That night, the video continued to spread across social media, collecting millions of views. I didn't know it yet, but by morning, my life, and my son's, would never be the same again. Every sunrise was a reminder. I couldn't afford to fail, not even once. The alarm clock always went off at 4:30, long before the sun had even thought about rising, its shrill tone slicing through the cold silence of our small apartment. I'd reach over to silence it before it woke my son, lying for a moment in the dark as the reality of another day pressed down on my chest like a weight I'd grown used to carrying. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and engine oil, the scent of exhaustion and survival. Every day started this way. Not with dreams, not with hope, but with the knowledge that everything I did had to count, because one small mistake could collapse everything I'd built for my boy. I'd slip quietly from bed, careful not to wake him, and stand for a second in the doorway of his room. He always slept curled up under that faded blanket his mother had sewn before she passed, his face calm and soft, untouched by the chaos waiting outside. Watching him like that gave me strength, a silent reminder of why I kept going when my body screamed to stop. Then I'd move into the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under my feet, and start breakfast with whatever was left from the week. Some days it was eggs if we had them, sometimes just toast and peanut butter. I never let him see how little there was. I'd always make it look like a choice, not a limitation. The coffee pot sputtered to life as I packed his lunch, a small sandwich, an apple, a note I'd scribbled quickly the night before telling him how proud I was of him. Those notes mattered. They were my way of filling the silence his mother used to fill with warmth and laughter. After breakfast, I'd put on my uniform, a faded shirt with my name stitched above the pocket, and sit for a moment staring at the bills spread across the table. Rent overdue by a week. Utility notice folded in half. A quiet warning. Gas card maxed out. The numbers blurred together, but I forced myself to smile as my son's door creaked open. "Morning, buddy," I'd say, mustering cheerfulness I didn't feel. He'd rub his eyes and nod, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "Morning, Dad." His voice was small, sleepy, and pure, the kind that made all the noise in my head quiet for a moment. I'd pour him orange juice, slide his breakfast over, and pretend not to notice when he glanced at the peeling paint or the flickering kitchen light. He didn't complain. He never did. But the silence between us said everything. After breakfast came the race against time, making sure he was dressed, his homework packed, his face clean. Then we'd step outside into the biting morning air, and I'd start the car. The old engine coughed like it was protesting another day of service. I'd whisper a small prayer every time I turned the key, promising it just one more week. The drive to school was quiet, except for the hum of the road beneath the tires and the occasional sigh from the passenger seat. After dropping him off, I'd head straight to my first job at the diner on Main Street. The neon sign flickered like it was as tired as the rest of us, and the smell of grease and burnt coffee clung to everything inside. I worked the early shift, frying eggs, wiping counters, taking orders from the same faces every morning. The regulars knew me by name, but not by story. To them, I was just the quiet guy who never complained, who worked faster than anyone else and smiled even when he looked like he hadn't slept in days. By noon, the heat from the kitchen would soak through my shirt, and my arms would ache from carrying trays. But there was no time to rest. When the manager finally waved me off, I'd rush to the parking lot, change shirts, and head to my second job at the warehouse. That place was colder, louder, harder. The air smelled like dust and metal, and the noise of forklifts drowned out any thought of peace. I loaded boxes until my back felt like it was splitting in half. Sometimes, the supervisor would yell for me to pick up the pace, and I'd bite my tongue because arguing meant risking hours. Hours meant less money, and less money meant another bill unpaid. It wasn't just exhaustion anymore. It was survival disguised as endurance. Every movement hurt, but every ache reminded me of why I was there. Each drop of sweat was a promise that my son would never feel the emptiness that had haunted me since the day I lost his mother. I still remember that day like it was carved into my bones. She had gone out for groceries, promising she'd be back before dinner. The rain came faster than the forecast said it would, and the truck that ran the red light didn't stop until it was too late. The police called me at work. I drove to the hospital so fast I don't even remember the streets. When I saw her, pale, still almost peaceful, something inside me fractured. She had been the light, the laughter, the reason our tiny home felt alive. And from that moment on, I had to become everything she once was, even though I didn't know how. By the time I got home that night, it was already dark. My clothes reeked of grease and metal dust, and my feet felt like they'd been walking for years. I dropped my bag by the door, quietly so I wouldn't wake my son, and went straight to the table where the bills waited like silent enemies. I opened the envelopes, doing the math over and over, but the numbers refused to make sense. It didn't matter how many hours I worked. The money always slipped away faster than I earned it. I poured myself a cup of leftover coffee, now cold and bitter, and sat in the half-light of the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. I looked around at our small space, the cracked tiles, the flickering bulb, the thin curtains that couldn't block the streetlight outside, and felt a wave of guilt that nearly broke me. My wife used to fill this place with warmth. She'd play music while cooking, sing softly under her breath. Now it was just the sound of me breathing and trying to hold everything together. Later that night, I walked into my son's room to check on him. He was asleep, his face turned toward the window, the faint glow of the streetlight brushing against his features. I knelt beside his bed and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'll do better," I whispered. "I promise." The next morning began like all the others, early, heavy, relentless. But something small shifted. As I was making breakfast, my son sat at the table, swinging his legs, his eyes bright but hesitant. "Dad," he said softly, breaking the silence. "There's a school trip next week. Everyone's going." I looked up, pretending not to hear the fear in his voice. "That sounds fun. Where are you going?" He smiled a little. "The Science Museum in the city. It costs $60. $60. The number hit harder than any insult ever could. I forced a smile, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my wallet. There were a few crumpled bills, some loose change, a gas receipt. I counted everything slowly, hoping I'd miscalculated somewhere, but when I finished, the total was clear. $8. That was all I had left until payday. I slipped the wallet back into my pocket and smiled again, hiding the panic building in my chest. "We'll figure it out, buddy," I said quietly. He nodded, trusting me completely, not knowing that behind my calm expression, I was already breaking apart. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized I had less than a week to find $60, and nothing left to give but the pieces of myself I hadn't already spent. Sometimes silence can be crueler than words, and the way they looked at me said everything. There's a particular kind of quiet that exists in places where judgment lingers, a silence that hums beneath every breath, every sideways glance, every forced smile. I used to think that people who judged you would at least have the decency to say it out loud, but they didn't need to. Their eyes said it all. Every morning, I could feel their opinions on my back, like the weight of invisible stones as I walked my son to school. It had been a few days since the video surfaced, and though no one mentioned it directly, I knew they had seen it. The whispers were softer now, replaced by looks that were half amusement, half pity. The kind of pity that made me feel even smaller than the laughter ever did. I would step out of the car, hold the door open for my son, and hear the faintest murmurs traveling through the cold morning air. My son walked faster now, a few steps ahead, pretending not to notice me, pretending we weren't together. The laughter wasn't loud anymore, but the silence was worse. It was in the way parents quickly averted their gaze when I passed, how conversation stopped for a second before resuming in hushed tones. Even the teachers greeted me differently now, their voices coated with sympathy instead of warmth. "You're doing such a good job, Mr. Carter," one of them said, her tone slow and deliberate, as though she were talking to someone standing on the edge of collapse. I smiled politely, thanked her, and walked away before she could see the sting behind my eyes. My son avoided eye contact with the other kids, keeping his head down as he shuffled inside. I caught sight of a few boys whispering and pointing toward me, one of them mimicking the limp in my stride, the other pretending to drive an invisible car that sputtered and died. Their laughter was small, but I heard it as though they had shouted. Kids learn cruelty from watching adults. That's what I kept telling myself as I turned away, pretending not to notice. The drive home was the longest part of the day. The car engine rattled in rhythm with my thoughts, both old and tired. Every noise from the dashboard felt like a reminder that I was one bad day away from losing everything. Still, I forced myself to hum a tune my wife used to love. Something light, something that reminded me of who I used to be before the world decided I was a joke. When I got home, I sat at the table, the quiet of the apartment pressing against my ears. The walls seemed closer these days. Bills piled in the corner. The fridge hummed weakly, half empty. I told myself this was temporary, that hard work eventually led somewhere. But lately I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. That afternoon, when I went to pick up my son, I noticed him standing off to the side near the playground, alone. The other kids were gathered around in small groups, laughing and talking, their parents watching from a distance with folded arms and perfect postures. My son looked at me as I approached, and in that split second, I saw something in his expression that I hadn't seen before. Hesitation. He glanced toward the other parents, and I understood what he was thinking even before he said it. "Dad, can you wait in the car?" His voice was soft, uncertain, but the words hit harder than he knew. I tried to smile. "Sure thing, buddy. I'll be right over there." I turned before he could see the way my throat tightened, walking slowly back to the car, pretending it didn't hurt. From the window, I watched him laugh awkwardly with another kid, though the laughter didn't reach his eyes. I knew he was trying to fit in, to hide from the version of me that the world had made a joke of. I couldn't blame him. At home, dinner was quiet. He picked at his food, eyes on his plate, while I asked the usual questions. How was school? What did you learn? Did you talk to your friends? His answers were short, polite, and distant. The sound of his fork scraping against the plate filled the space where our laughter used to be. Later that night, I stood in the doorway of his room, watching him stare out the window, lost in thought. The light from the street outside painted soft lines across his face, and for a moment, he looked so much like his mother that it made my chest ache. I wanted to tell him that it was okay to feel embarrassed, that I understood what it was like to feel like you didn't belong, but I didn't know how. The words stayed trapped behind my teeth. The next morning, things didn't get better. As I pulled into the school parking lot, I noticed a group of mothers near the entrance whispering, their eyes flicking toward me and then away. One of them said something that made the others laugh softly, and I caught a few of the words. Viral, poor guy, his kid. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't look at them. I focused on my son, who sat beside me, staring straight ahead. "Hey," I said gently. "You ready for today?" He didn't look at me. "Yeah," he muttered. When we stopped, he grabbed his bag and stepped out before I could say anything else. He didn't wait for me like he used to. He didn't wave. He just walked off, his shoulders tense, his steps quick. I watched him go until he disappeared inside the building. For the first time, I didn't follow. I couldn't. I sat there for a while, staring at the empty seat beside me, wondering when exactly I had started losing him. By evening, the distance between us felt wider than ever. He barely spoke at dinner. When I asked him if something was wrong, he just shrugged. The silence stretched until it filled the room. Finally, I pushed my plate away and said quietly, "You can tell me anything. You know that, right?" He didn't look up. "You wouldn't understand." The words stung, sharper than I expected. "Try me." He slammed his fork down, eyes flashing. "You don't get it, Dad. Everyone laughs at me because of you, because of that stupid video. They call me sad boy at school." His voice cracked as he spoke, a mix of anger and shame twisting every syllable. "I'm tired of it." I sat frozen, the air thick between us. "I didn't mean for that to happen," I said softly. "I was just trying to—" "Trying to what?" he snapped, his voice rising. "To make everyone think we're pathetic? You don't get it. You're embarrassing." The words hit harder than any punch could. My throat burned, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I know it's hard," I whispered, "but I'm doing everything I can for you. I'm trying." He stood up, tears forming in his eyes. "I wish Mom was here instead of you." The words fell between us like glass shattering on a cold floor. For a moment, the world stopped. I stared at him, my mind blank, my chest hollow. He froze, too, realizing what he had said, but it was too late. The silence that followed was unbearable, the kind of silence that tears through you and leaves nothing but echoes behind. I didn't yell. I didn't move. I just stood there, hearing her name, his pain, my failure, all tangled together in one unbearable moment. He turned away, running to his room, slamming the door behind him. I sank into the chair, the same one I'd sat in 1,000 times before, but that night it felt different, heavier, colder. I stared at the empty plate on the table, at the flickering light above, at the small apartment that had once felt like a home and now felt like a punishment. Upstairs, I could hear him crying softly behind his door, and I realized with a hollow ache that for the first time since his mother's death, I had truly lost him. Not to fate, not to tragedy, but to shame. That night, I promised myself something. I would give my boy everything I never had, even if it killed me. The words he had thrown at me earlier that evening still echoed through the small apartment long after his door slammed shut. I wish Mom was here instead of you. They looped in my head until they stopped sounding like his voice and started sounding like my own self-accusation. I sat in the dark living room, elbows on my knees, staring at the carpet that needed replacing 3 years ago, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the ceiling. The whole place seemed to breathe with me, shallow, tired, struggling to keep going. Every corner of that apartment held memories of her. The chipped ceramic mug she loved, still sitting on the shelf. The photo on the wall of all 3 of us on the pier, sunlight spilling across our faces. Her handwriting on a grocery list I'd never thrown away. My son's words had cracked something deep inside me, and from that crack poured everything I'd tried so hard to bury. Guilt for not being enough, grief I'd never let myself feel, fear that maybe everyone else had been right about me all along. I sat there for hours, watching shadows move across the floor as the night crawled by. I thought about how her laughter used to fill this room, how she could calm him down with just a touch. I thought about the way he looked at me now, not with love, not even with anger, but with quiet disappointment. Somewhere along the line, the boy who once believed I could fix anything had started to believe that I was the reason everything was broken. Around midnight, I finally stood and walked into his room. The door was cracked open, and I could hear his uneven breathing, the kind that comes after too many tears. He was asleep, clutching that stuffed bear his mother had bought him the day he was born. In the dim light, he looked so small, so fragile, and I realized that for all his anger, he was still just a child, a boy who missed his mother and didn't understand why life had to be this cruel. I sat on the edge of his bed and whispered softly, "I'm sorry." The words felt heavy, like stones in my mouth. "I'm sorry I've made things so hard for you, but I promise I'll make it right. I don't know how yet, but I will." That was the moment something inside me hardened. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the ridicule. None of it mattered anymore. If I had to work myself into the ground to give him a better life, then so be it. If my body gave out in the process, at least he'd have something to hold on to. Something better than this. The next morning I woke before dawn again, but this time with a different kind of resolve burning through the fog of sleep. I skipped breakfast, threw on my work clothes, and started calling every number I could think of. Anyone who might have a job, any extra shift, any side gig that paid in cash. By noon, I had lined up a cleaning shift at a mechanic's shop after my regular work hours. It wasn't much, but it was something. The days blurred together after that. I'd work the diner from 5 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, eat a sandwich on the way to the warehouse, work there until 7, and then head to the mechanic's garage, scrubbing floors and cleaning tools until well past midnight. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Meals turned into vending machine snacks eaten standing up. At first I told myself it was temporary, that it was just until I could catch up on rent and pay for that school trip. But as the weeks went by, the debt only seemed to shift, never disappear. No matter how many hours I put in, the money slipped away into gas, repairs, groceries, and the endless stream of bills that never stopped coming. My body started to rebel. The dark circles under my eyes deepened. My hands trembled when I carried trays at the diner. And I'd sometimes have to sit in the back room for a minute to catch my breath. A dull ache began to live permanently in my chest. A warning I ignored. Pain didn't scare me anymore. Failure did. People noticed the change. "You look like hell, Ethan," my coworker at the diner said one morning as she refilled the sugar dispensers. I laughed it off, said I was fine, said I just needed more coffee. But even laughter hurt now. It made my ribs ache. At home, my son watched me with quiet unease. He never mentioned the argument again, never apologized, and I never asked him to. Instead, we existed in a fragile truce. He'd do his homework at the table while I mended the loose seam on my work boots. Sometimes he'd ask if I was tired, and I'd lie, tell him I was just thinking. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Kurt from the warehouse. He spoke fast, direct, his tone businesslike. "I heard you've been looking for more hours," he said. "Yeah," I replied, wiping my hands on a towel. "There's a crew working nights out at the construction site off Highway 17. Dangerous work, long shifts, pays triple. They need men who don't ask questions." Triple pay. The words rang in my head like a bell. For a moment, I saw my son's face, his hopeful smile, the disappointment he tried so hard to hide. With that kind of money, maybe I could finally breathe. Maybe I could pay the bills, fix the car, get him something new for once instead of used. "What's the catch?" I asked. "No catch," Kurt said after a pause. "Just rough conditions. Long hours. You'll be outside all night. But it's honest pay for honest work." I hesitated. My back ached just thinking about it. My chest throbbed like a reminder that I was already stretched too thin. "I'll do it," I said finally. "Good," he replied. "Start tomorrow night. Midnight." When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my hands. They looked older than I remembered. Cracked, rough, veins standing out like lines on a map that led nowhere. I could feel the exhaustion in my bones, but under it was something stronger, a quiet fire that refused to die. Later that night, after my son had gone to bed, I went outside and stood on the porch. The air was cold, the kind that stings your lungs, but it felt clean. I looked up at the sky, at the thin slice of moon hanging there, and whispered to her. My wife. "I don't know if you can hear me," I said softly, "but I'm trying. I'm trying to make him proud of me again." Inside, the clock struck midnight, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. I knew what I was getting into. The man on the phone hadn't needed to warn me. I could already imagine the risks. Heavy machinery, unstable scaffolding, sleepless nights. But I didn't care. What mattered was that this job could change everything. It could give my son the life he deserved. One where he didn't have to shrink away from laughter or hide behind shame. I went to bed just before dawn, the faint light creeping through the blinds. My muscles screamed, my heart felt like it was carrying a boulder, but my mind was finally quiet. I had made my decision. The next morning, when my alarm buzzed, I didn't hesitate. Despite the warnings, despite my body begging for rest, I took the job. Convincing myself it wasn't about risk or pride anymore. It was about love, about redemption, about a father's promise that no matter what it cost, his son would never feel less than anyone else again. They saw me as lazy, but none of them knew what I was doing after the sun went down. People only see what they want to see. They saw the tired father who dropped his kid off in a beat-up car, the man who looked like he had given up on himself. They didn't see the version of me that came alive when the rest of the town went to sleep. The man who stepped into darkness night after night, trading hours of his life for a few extra dollars. When the diner closed and the warehouse lights went out, I'd head straight for the construction site off Highway 17. The first night I arrived, the air was thick with dust and diesel, the sky bruised with clouds that never moved. Floodlights cast long shadows across half-finished concrete walls, and the ground vibrated with the thud of machinery. Men worked in silence, faces hidden under helmets, eyes dull with exhaustion. It wasn't a place you talked much. It was a place you survived. The foreman, a man named Kurt, handed me a reflective vest and pointed toward a stack of steel beams. "You'll be lifting, cutting, carrying," he said. "Keep your head down and don't get in anyone's way." The pay was triple what I earned anywhere else, but it felt like trading pieces of my body for cash. The shifts stretched from midnight to sunrise. The cold bit into my fingers until I couldn't feel them, and the clang of metal rattled through my skull long after the machines stopped. There were moments when my arms gave out, when my knees shook from the weight, but I kept pushing because I didn't have the luxury of stopping. During breaks, I'd sit on a stack of lumber, staring out at the black horizon, trying not to think about how tired I was. The other men would light cigarettes or stare at their phones, faces lit by dull blue light. I didn't talk much. I didn't have energy for conversation. Every muscle in my body throbbed, my palms split open with tiny cuts that burned when the cold air hit them. When my shift ended, I'd drive home as the sky began to turn gray, fighting to keep my eyes open. My hands would cramp around the steering wheel, and I'd slap my face to stay awake. More than once, I caught myself drifting toward the edge of the road, jerking back just in time. I'd pull into the parking lot of our apartment complex right as my son's alarm clock probably went off upstairs. I'd sneak inside quietly, wash the dirt from my hands, and make breakfast before he woke up, pretending like I'd just gotten out of bed. He'd shuffle into the kitchen, hair messy, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Dad," he'd say. "Morning, buddy," I'd answer, forcing my voice steady. I'd pour his cereal, ask him about his homework, pretend I wasn't seeing double from exhaustion. When he'd leave for school, I'd collapse into the chair he'd just vacated, sometimes falling asleep for an hour before heading to my afternoon shift. That became my life. 2 hours of sleep here, 3 there. A nap instead of a night. My body started to betray me. The headaches came first, pounding behind my eyes like a second heartbeat. Then came the dizziness, the way the world tilted slightly every time I stood too fast. The mirror became a stranger. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, skin the color of ash. My coworkers noticed, though they didn't say it directly. At the diner, my manager frowned as I wiped the counter slower than usual. "You okay, Ethan?" she asked. "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile. "Been helping out at night." She sighed. "You've got to take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup, you know." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I didn't have the energy to explain that some people don't have cups at all, just leaking hands they use to hold whatever they can before it slips away. The nights at the construction site grew colder, and the work got harder. The foreman started assigning me to more dangerous sections. The high scaffolding, the steel cutting. My hands shook whenever I lifted the welding torch, and I could feel the heat seeping through my gloves. I lost weight without trying. Food became an afterthought. The only thing that kept me going was the image of my son smiling when I'd finally tell him we could afford that trip, maybe even buy him something new for once. But the body keeps score. The chest pain that had been a dull pressure turned sharper, like a knife pressing from the inside. Sometimes, when I bent to lift a beam, a flash of white light would burst behind my eyes, and I'd have to stop, pretending to tie my shoe until the world stopped spinning. I told myself it was fine, that it would pass, that once I made enough, I'd rest. But enough kept moving further away, a finish line that retreated every time I got close. At home, I made sure my son never saw any of it. I laughed when he talked about school, helped him with homework, and listened to him describe his favorite science experiment with wide-eyed enthusiasm. He didn't need to know that while he slept, I was out there, carrying steel and swallowing pain. He didn't need to see me limping into the shower at dawn, washing away the grime before he woke. Sometimes, when he was at school, I'd drive to the plasma center across town, donate blood for cash, and tell myself I could spare it. The nurse always frowned at my blood pressure, warned me that I needed more rest. "I'm fine," I'd say and smile. I wasn't fine. I was fading. Each night, before leaving for the site, I'd check on my son, standing in his doorway for a moment. His breathing was slow and even, his face peaceful. That peace was worth every ache, every hour of lost sleep. I'd whisper, "Just a little longer, kiddo, just a little longer." Then I'd step back into the cold, my boots crunching on the frozen ground as I disappeared into the dark. Weeks passed. My paychecks got bigger, but my body felt smaller. I started forgetting things, simple things, like where I parked or what day it was. One night, I dropped a wrench from the scaffolding and watched it fall, realizing too late that my hand was shaking uncontrollably. Kurt yelled something from below, but his voice sounded far away, muffled by the ringing in my ears. I gripped the railing, breathing through the pain until my vision cleared. When the shift ended, I told him I was fine. He didn't believe me. "You need a break," he said. "You look like you're about to pass out." I forced a laugh. "Can't afford a break." He started to argue, then stopped. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning away. The drive home that morning was a blur. I couldn't remember the road, just flashes of light and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. When I pulled into the driveway, the sky was turning pink with sunrise. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, the pain in my chest, sharp now, spreading down my arm. I sat there for a long moment, breathing shallowly, waiting for it to fade. Eventually, it did. Just enough to let me move. I went inside, dropped my bag by the door, and headed to the bathroom to wash up before making breakfast. When I bent over the sink, the room spun. A cough rose from my throat, deep and harsh. I grabbed the counter, trying to steady myself, and when I looked down, I saw the sink spotted with red. For a second, I just stared, too tired to be afraid. Then I reached for a towel, wiped my mouth, and whispered to my reflection, "Not yet. He still needs me." My chest ached with every breath, but I forced myself upright. The day was just beginning, and so was the lie I had to live. That everything was fine, that I could keep going, that nothing could stop a father who refused to quit. I thought I could handle it all, until my body finally gave out. There's a certain rhythm to exhaustion, a pace your body learns when it's pushed past its limits. For weeks, I had been living in that rhythm, moving like a machine that refused to break, though the warning signs had been there, all along. The trembling hands, the pounding chest, the dizzy spells that came like waves whenever I stood too quickly. But every time I thought about stopping, I saw my son's face, and that was enough to keep me going. That night started like every other. The air at the construction site was cold enough to bite through my jacket, and the wind carried the bitter tang of concrete dust. My breath came out in short, visible bursts as I adjusted the straps of my gloves and joined the crew. The floodlights cut through the darkness, illuminating faces etched with fatigue. Kurt barked orders over the sound of machinery, his voice echoing through the steel skeleton of the building we were piecing together. I was lifting beams again, the kind that made my shoulders ache and my spine scream. Every pull sent a sharp pain through my ribs, but I gritted my teeth and kept moving. There was no time to rest, no room for weakness. My son needed me strong, and I refused to let him see me as anything less. The night dragged on, heavy and relentless. I remember the smell of diesel, the screech of metal, and the feeling that the world was spinning faster than usual. My vision blurred as I reached for another beam, my grip slipping. I blinked hard, forcing the dizziness down, but it came back stronger. My knees buckled, and before I could steady myself, the ground tilted. The next thing I remember was the cold concrete against my cheek and voices shouting somewhere above me. "Ethan! Hey, somebody get the medic!" Boots pounded around me, flashlights flickered, and hands grabbed my shoulders. My body felt distant, disconnected, like I was watching from somewhere outside myself. The edges of the world grew dark, and the sounds began to fade until all I could hear was my heartbeat. Fast, uneven, like it was trying to escape my chest. When I opened my eyes again, the world was white. The harsh light of a hospital room stabbed through my eyelids, and for a moment I thought I was dreaming. Machines beeped steadily beside me, and the smell of antiseptic burned my nose. My chest hurt, every breath sharp like glass. A nurse noticed I was awake and hurried over. "You're lucky they brought you in when they did," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You passed out from exhaustion and dehydration. Your blood pressure was dangerously low." I tried to sit up, but the room spun. "I'm fine," I mumbled, my voice hoarse. "I just need some rest." She frowned. "You need more than rest, Mr. Carter. You need time off. Real time off. Your body is giving out. You keep pushing like this, and you're going to do permanent damage." I nodded, pretending to agree, but inside, panic surged. Time off meant no pay. No pay meant no rent, no food, no school trip, no chance to make things right. I couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Not when I was this close to catching up. A few hours later, a doctor came in, clipboard in hand, expression serious. "Mr. Carter," he began, "we've run some tests. Your blood pressure and stress levels are dangerously high. You've been overworking your body for too long. You need to stop before your heart does." His words felt unreal. "How long do I need to stay here?" I asked, already knowing the answer I wanted. "At least a few days. You need observation, hydration, and rest." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded impossible. "I can't stay that long," I said. "I've got work." The doctor sighed. "If you go back out there too soon, you won't make it much longer. You're putting your life at risk." "Then I'll risk it," I said quietly. "My life's not the one that matters." He looked at me for a long time, pity in his eyes, the kind I'd seen too many times before. "At least let us keep you overnight," he said finally. I agreed, but even that felt like a betrayal. I lay in the hospital bed that night, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the seconds between the beeps of the monitor. Every sound was a reminder of how fragile I'd become. I thought of my son sleeping alone at home, of the bills waiting on the counter, of the promise I'd made to make everything better. How could I rest when the world refused to stop demanding more of me? By morning, I had made up my mind. I signed the discharge papers before the doctor arrived, scrawling my name with a shaking hand. The nurse tried to protest, but I smiled and said, "I'll be fine." When I stepped outside, the sunlight felt too bright, almost mocking. I squinted against it, feeling the weight of the hospital bracelet still clinging to my wrist. I tore it off and tossed it into the trash on my way to the car. Back home, I showered, changed, and headed straight to the diner, pretending nothing had happened. The manager raised an eyebrow when she saw me. "You sure you're okay?" "Just a rough night," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm good." But I wasn't good. Every step felt heavier than the last. The pain in my chest flared whenever I bent down, a warning I ignored. My body was trying to stop me, but I refused to listen. I couldn't afford to. Later that evening, after my shift, I checked my phone while sitting in the car. The screen was filled with notifications, messages, tags, and a familiar thumbnail. The video. The one that had started it all. Someone had re-uploaded it, but this time the title was different. "The saddest dad in the world. Where is he now?" Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The video was the same. Me dropping my son off at school, the laughter in the background, my old car rattling. But the comments were different. The tone had shifted. "Poor guy looks like he's just trying his best. This broke my heart. People can be so cruel. Does anyone know who he is? I hope he's okay." For a moment, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to be angry. These were the same people who had mocked me months ago. But another part of me felt something else entirely. Confusion, disbelief, maybe even relief. It was too late for sympathy, but still, it was something. Then I noticed a new comment pinned at the top. It read, "I think I found him. His name's Ethan Carter. He's from Brookfield. You won't believe what he's been doing." My stomach dropped. Someone was digging into my life. Someone had connected the dots. The diner, the construction site, maybe even the hospital. The thought of my private struggle becoming another viral story made my chest tighten. I turned off the phone and stared out the windshield. The reflection in the glass showed a man I barely recognized. Hollow eyes, lines etched deep into his face, shoulders hunched under invisible weight. The sympathy of strangers wouldn't change anything. They didn't know me. They didn't know the truth behind the tired smile. That night, as I drove toward another shift I should have skipped, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world had started watching me again. But this time, someone wasn't laughing. Someone was digging, and they were about to uncover the truth I'd fought so hard to keep hidden. My son was never supposed to find out, but secrets have a way of breaking the walls we build. I used to believe I could protect him from everything. The hunger, the worry, the truth. I thought if I smiled hard enough, if I hid my pain deep enough, then maybe the world would spare him from carrying the same burdens that had carved themselves into me. But secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of clawing their way to the surface. And mine were no different. It started on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The kind of day that feels harmless at first. The air too calm to suggest anything is about to change. I was still at work, somewhere between shifts, while my son was home early from school because of a half-day schedule. I had left the apartment keys with the neighbor, Mrs. Dorsey, a kind woman in her 60s who sometimes checked in on him when I couldn't. She thought I was working only one job. She didn't know about the construction site, the long nights, or the hospital visit. But people talk, and sometimes they talk too loudly. That day she stopped by with a small tray of cookies, meaning well, as always. My son let her in. "You know," she said, setting the tray on the table, "your dad works too much. I told him the other day he needs to slow down before that heart of his gives out." He froze mid-bite. "What do you mean?" "Oh," she said quickly, realizing she'd said too much. "I just mean he's been tired lately, that's all. You know how adults worry too much." She smiled, trying to brush it off, but the damage was done. The seed of worry had already been planted. After she left, he sat there for a long time, staring at the cookies. The thought wouldn't leave his mind. His father's heart, his exhaustion, the way his hands trembled when pouring juice, the nights he thought he heard me coughing through the walls. He tried to push the thought away, but it kept returning, stronger each time. He went into my room. The door creaked open, and for a moment he hesitated. He knew I didn't like him rummaging through my things. But curiosity, mixed with fear, has a way of erasing rules. The drawers were filled with the clutter of a life lived paycheck to paycheck. Old work gloves, receipts, broken pens, unpaid bills folded neatly and stacked like sins waiting for confession. He dug deeper, his hands shaking slightly. Then he found the envelope. It was thick, sealed, but his name was written on the front in my handwriting. "To my son, when you're older." He stared at it, torn between guilt and curiosity, then slowly peeled it open. Inside were hospital papers, test results, and prescriptions with my name printed at the top. Words he didn't understand jumped out at him. Cardiac strain, stress-induced hypertension, risk of heart failure. His throat tightened. Underneath the medical forms was a letter, handwritten on lined paper, edges creased from being folded and refolded. He unfolded it carefully, the way a person might handle something fragile. My words stared back at him in faded blue ink. "Son, I don't know when you'll read this. Maybe when you're grown. Maybe when I'm gone. I just want you to know that every long night, every drop of sweat, every ache in my body, it's all been for you. You're the reason I get up when I don't have the strength. You're the reason I keep breathing when everything hurts. I know I've made mistakes, and I'm sorry if you ever felt ashamed of me. But if you ever doubt how much I love you, remember this. I would break myself 1,000 times just to see you whole." He read it once, then again, tears blurring the words until they ran together like ink in rain. He pressed the paper to his chest, as if trying to hold on to the meaning behind it, as if he could stop the ache that was spreading through him. Everything he thought he knew began to unravel. The laughter at school, the whispers, the embarrassment. He saw it all differently now. His father's old car wasn't a sign of failure, it was proof of sacrifice. The tired eyes weren't weakness, they were love stretched to its limits. Every bruise, every tear, every moment of silence had been a shield built for him. Guilt hit him hard. The argument replayed in his head, the words he'd thrown in anger, the look on my face when he said he wished his mother were here instead. He could still hear the quiet pain in my voice, when I didn't fight back, when I just sat there taking it. He realized now that he hadn't hurt a man who was weak. He had hurt the man who had given everything just to see him smile. He folded the letter back carefully, his hands trembling, and placed it back in the envelope. Then he looked at the hospital papers again. The most recent date was from just a few weeks ago. That was when I had collapsed at the site. He hadn't known I'd been in the hospital. No one had told him. Panic began to crawl up his throat. What if I was sick again? What if something had happened? He grabbed his jacket and the envelope, then ran out the door, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The cold air hit him as he ran into the street, his breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. He went first to the diner. The bell above the door jingled as he pushed inside, startling the waitress behind the counter. "Is my dad here?" he asked, out of breath. She looked confused. "He left hours ago, sweetheart. Are you okay?" He shook his head and backed out before she could say more. Next, he ran to the warehouse. The man at the front gate frowned when he saw him. "You looking for Ethan Carter?" "Yes," he gasped. "I'm his son." The man's expression softened. "He's not here tonight, kid. Took some time off, I think. Try the construction site, Highway 17. The boy nodded and took off running again, his heart pounding as the world blurred past him. The sky had turned gray, the wind sharp and restless. He didn't know how far the site was, only that he needed to get there. He needed to see me, to tell me he was sorry, to tell me that he finally understood. When he arrived, the place looked abandoned. Machinery stood silent, floodlights off, the ground littered with empty coffee cups and muddy footprints. He called out, "Dad?" But his voice only echoed back at him, swallowed by the open air. He ran through the site, checking behind stacks of lumber and half-built walls. Nothing. No workers, no lights, no movement. He spotted Kurt's trailer on the edge of the lot and banged on the door. A tired-looking man answered, surprise flashing in his eyes when he saw the boy. "You're Ethan's kid, right?" "Yes, where is he?" Kurt hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's not here. Haven't seen him since last night." "What do you mean?" The boy's voice trembled. "He's supposed to be working." Kurt shook his head slowly. "He said he wasn't feeling well. Told me he needed some air. That was hours ago." The boy's face went pale. "He's not home either." Kurt frowned, worry flickering across his face. "Look, kid, I'm sure he just needed a break. He works harder than anyone I've ever met. But if he's not home—" He trailed off, realizing there was nothing reassuring left to say. The boy turned away, clutching the envelope against his chest. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the empty lot. Somewhere out there, his father was alone, sick, still working, still fighting. And for the first time, he wasn't embarrassed. He was terrified. He ran into the darkness, calling for me, but the only answer was the hollow echo of his own voice. Because that night, no one knew where I was. And for the first time, even I wasn't sure I'd make it back home. Love doesn't always look like comfort. Sometimes, it looks like breaking yourself, so your child can stand tall. The night it happened, the sky was darker than usual. the kind of black that seems to swallow even the stars. My body was a storm of pain and fatigue, but I told myself this was the last shift, the final push before I could rest. The bills were caught up for now, my son's trip money finally tucked inside an envelope on the counter at home. All I had to do was make it through this one night. Just one. When I arrived at the site, the air was thick with the scent of gasoline and wet earth. Floodlights threw long, trembling shadows across half-finished walls and tangled metal beams. The hum of machinery filled the air, a heavy, constant drone that blended with the echo of hammer strikes. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest, too fast, too hard, but I ignored it like I always did. There was no room for weakness. Not tonight. Kurt saw me and frowned. "You sure you're up for this, Ethan? You look like hell." I forced a small laugh. "Hell's not so bad when it pays triple." He shook his head. "You're gonna work yourself into the ground. Then at least I'll have earned it," I said, picking up my gloves. We started the shift like any other, lifting beams, guiding them into place, tightening bolts. The cold bit through my jacket, but sweat still rolled down my back from the effort. Every breath burned. Every movement sent a pulse of pain through my ribs. But I kept thinking about my son. I pictured him at the museum, laughing with his classmates, maybe holding up one of those cheap, plastic souvenirs in the gift shop. I wanted that image burned into my mind, the reward for all this pain. Around 3 a.m, the wind began to howl, sharp and fast. The scaffolding creaked above us, and Kurt called out for everyone to be careful. I was on the lower level, tightening a section of rebar, when I heard it, a metallic snap that cut through the noise. A cable somewhere above had given way. The world shifted. A steel beam swung loose, crashing into a pile of lumber. Shouts erupted around me. Dust filled the air thick and choking. I heard someone yelling, "Help, I'm stuck!" and turned toward the voice. One of the newer guys, a kid barely 20, was trapped under a section of scaffolding that had collapsed. Flames sparked from a ruptured generator nearby, the smell of burning fuel spreading fast. I ran. My legs felt heavy. My chest screamed, but I ran anyway. The others hesitated, frozen between fear and instinct. I dropped to my knees beside the kid. The beam pinning his leg was thick, heavy, impossible for him to move alone. His face was pale, his eyes wild. "I can't feel my leg," he cried. "Don't move," I said, gripping the beam. "We'll get you out." Kurt shouted something behind me, but I couldn't hear over the roar of my own heartbeat. The fire was spreading, slow at first, then faster as it caught on spilled fuel. I pulled with everything I had. The metal didn't budge. Pain ripped through my chest, but I didn't stop. I shifted my footing, pushed again, and this time the beam lifted just enough. "Go!" I shouted. "Crawl out!" The kid dragged himself free, gasping, crawling toward safety. I dropped the beam, my arms trembling violently. The world swayed, the smoke stinging my eyes. I stumbled back, coughing hard, my lungs burning. I could hear Kurt yelling for everyone to clear out. The fire was spreading too quickly now. As I turned to run, the ground beneath me groaned, a warning. A split second later, part of the framework gave way. I felt the floor drop out from under me, metal shrieking as it collapsed. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. My vision blurred, the edges of the world fading in and out. Someone was shouting my name. I could see figures through the smoke, running towards the exit, but their voices sounded far away, like echoes underwater. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't listen. Pain exploded through my chest, sharp, deep, final. I knew in that moment that something inside me had finally given out. The heat was unbearable now. Flames licked across the beams, the air thick with smoke. I could hear the fire trucks in the distance, sirens cutting through the night. But I knew they wouldn't reach me in time. My breathing came shallow and uneven. Each inhale felt heavier than the last. I looked up through the smoke, toward the small patch of sky visible through the broken ceiling. The stars had disappeared, hidden, behind the black clouds. My vision blurred again, and for a moment I saw him, my boy, standing there at the edge of the sight, looking at me with those wide, innocent eyes. I thought about the letter he would one day read, the one I had written when I thought I might not make it. I hoped he'd understand that this wasn't a mistake, that I had done it all for him. Every bruise, every scar, every sleepless night had been worth it. Because even if the world had laughed at me, I had loved him harder than life itself. I thought of his mother, too, her laughter, the way she used to tell me I worried too much. I could almost hear her voice now, calm and soft, the way it was before everything fell apart. Maybe she was waiting. Maybe this was how we found our way back to each other. My breathing slowed. The fire glowed brighter around me, turning the metal orange and red. The pain began to fade, replaced by a strange warmth. My last thought, as the darkness began to pull me under, was of my son's smile, the one that made everything worth it. "I did it," I whispered to no one. "He'll be okay." The world went quiet. When the firefighters arrived, they found the site half consumed by flames. One worker had been pulled out alive, the young man I had saved, but another was still inside. By dawn, the fire was out, and what remained of the structure stood silent under a gray sky. The next morning, the headlines spread across every news outlet. "Hero Dad Dies Saving Coworker," identified as viral single father. The same world that laughed at me was now crying over what I did. News travels differently when it carries guilt. It doesn't just spread, it sinks, deep and heavy, into the hearts of those who once thought themselves blameless. By morning, my story was everywhere. Headlines filled the screens, each one written in that same tone of shocked admiration that people reserve for the dead. "Single dad dies saving coworker from collapse." "Hero father gives his life in tragic construction accident." The viral sad dad everyone mocked was a real-life hero. Within hours, the same video that had once been a joke was being reshared across every social media platform. But this time, the laughter was gone. People who had once typed cruel comments were now flooding the feed with apologies, memorial posts, and hashtags about strength, sacrifice, and fatherly love. The internet is strange that way. It turns people into villains one day and martyrs the next. Strangers who had never met me now spoke of me like they had always known me. My face was everywhere, on news channels, in think pieces, in sentimental tributes set to piano music. The photo of me standing beside my old car, my son holding my hand, now carried captions like, "Real heroes don't wear capes." For the first time, the world saw me, not the tired man in worn clothes, not the target of mockery, but the father who had given everything. Neighbors who used to look away when I passed them were suddenly on television, giving tearful interviews. "I had no idea he was struggling so much," one woman said, her mascara running as she spoke. "He was always so quiet, so polite. We didn't know." Another voice followed. "He used to come home late every night. I thought maybe he was lazy or just unlucky. I didn't realize he was working 3 jobs." The local news aired footage of the burnt construction site, the camera lingering on the twisted metal and the charred ground. The reporter's voice trembled as she narrated. "Ethan Carter, a single father from Brookfield, lost his life saving a coworker during a site collapse last night. The man he saved says he owes everything to Ethan's courage." That man, Michael, the kid I'd pulled from under the beam, stood before the cameras, his leg wrapped in a brace, tears streaking the dirt still clinging to his face. "He didn't even hesitate," he said. "He could have run, but he didn't. He told me to crawl while he lifted the beam, and I did. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here." He paused, voice breaking. "He told me to go, and I never got to thank him." Clips of my old life began to surface. The diner where I worked posted a picture of me behind the counter, My sleeves rolled up, smiling at a customer. The caption read, "He worked harder than anyone. He never complained. Rest in peace, Ethan." The warehouse crew pooled together to raise funds for my son. Local churches organized food drives. Even the same parents who once whispered about me in the school parking lot were now showing up on camera, speaking softly about how Ethan was a devoted father who just wanted the best for his boy. It was surreal, how quickly people rewrote the story once it was too late to matter. The boy who had once been invisible now became the focus of the entire town's sympathy. Reporters knocked on the apartment door. Cameras camped outside the building. Gifts and cards began piling up on the porch. Flowers, teddy bears, handwritten notes that all said the same thing. "We're sorry." Inside, the apartment was silent. My son sat on the floor of his room, surrounded by the letters and the envelope I had left behind. He hadn't gone to school. He hadn't spoken to anyone. Every channel that played my name only tightened the knot of guilt in his chest. He could still hear the way he had shouted at me that night, the cruel words that had cut deeper than he'd ever meant them to. "I wish Mom was here instead of you." Now those words replayed in his mind like a punishment. He watched the news coverage in silence. When the reporter said my name, his face crumpled. When the man I had saved spoke about me as a hero, he buried his face in his hands and sobbed. He didn't care about the praise or the sympathy. All he wanted was another chance, just one more morning to sit across from, me at the table. One more ride to school where he wouldn't hide his face. One more chance to tell me that he was proud. The neighbors who used to avoid him now left food at the door. He didn't open it. Teachers called to offer their condolences. He didn't answer. The world was grieving for a man they never knew, but he was grieving for his father, the man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and never once let it crush him. At night, the sound of voices outside grew louder. Reporters, strangers, people lighting candles at the foot of the apartment steps. Their words were full of admiration and regret. He gave his life for someone else. He worked himself to death just to give his son a better life. He was the kind of father everyone should have. But inside that small apartment, all of it felt hollow. My son didn't see a hero. He saw the man he had failed to understand. The town decided to organize a memorial. Flyers went up everywhere. Community gathering to honor Ethan Carter, Brookfield High Gymnasium, Saturday at 5 p.m. The school principal called, offering to have students help with decorations. The mayor issued a public statement calling me a testament to the selflessness of ordinary Americans. For once, the same people who had laughed were now standing in line to say sorry. The irony was unbearable. All those apologies spoken to the air, all those flowers laid on empty ground. People who never saw me when I stood among them now stood in silence to honor me. As the Memorial Day approached, the town buzzed with preparations. The diner where I'd worked closed early that evening. The construction site crew volunteered to set up chairs and lights. Even the parents from my son's school showed up to help. It was as though everyone needed to wash their conscience clean with action. But inside the apartment, behind a closed bedroom door, my son refused to move. The world outside was ready to honor me, but he wasn't ready to face it. He sat by the window, clutching the letter I'd written to him, the one he had found only days before. He had read it so many times that the creases had started to tear. The ink had smudged where his tears had fallen. When the sun dipped below the horizon, he could see the candlelight from the street below, flickering like small, restless stars. The voices carried upward, soft prayers, sniffles, the low hum of a crowd trying to make peace with something they couldn't undo. He closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "You kept your promise, Dad. You gave me everything, and I didn't even say thank you." The crowd outside began to sing. An old hymn, broken but beautiful. The sound floated through the window like a ghost of forgiveness. But my son couldn't bear to listen. He pressed his palms to his ears, his heart heavy with regret. Downstairs, The crowd held candles for the man they now called a hero. But upstairs, behind the locked door of a small room, a boy sat alone in silence, whispering the same words over and over. "It's my fault. It's all my fault." Sometimes it takes losing someone to realize they were the only person who ever truly loved you. The morning of the memorial felt heavier than any morning before it. The world outside was bright and unreasonably calm, the kind of day that made grief feel out of place. My son woke up to the faint hum of voices outside the apartment building. Neighbors gathering, cars pulling up, footsteps echoing down the street. The sound of life going on without me. He hadn't planned on going. For days he'd told himself that he couldn't face it. The stares, the pity, the endless apologies that would mean nothing. But that morning, something shifted. Maybe it was the sunlight slipping through the blinds, landing softly on the letter he had been holding every night since he found it. Or maybe it was the sound of my name, whispered gently by people outside his window. Whatever it was, it pulled him from bed. He dressed quietly. Jeans, an old hoodie, his father's jacket draped over his shoulders. It still smelled faintly of engine oil and coffee. The fabric was worn at the cuffs, the zipper crooked from years of use. But when he slipped it on, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Warmth. The walk to the school gymnasium, where the town had decided to hold the memorial, felt unreal. The streets were lined with people carrying candles, flowers, and signs with words like, "Thank you, Ethan," and "Our hero." Children held drawings of a man with a kind smile beside a little boy, a cartoon version of a life the world had never truly seen. Inside the gym, the air was thick with emotion. Rows of folding chairs filled the floor, and every single one was taken. At the front stood a large photo of me, smiling faintly, my son beside me, his small hand gripping mine. Candles flickered beneath the frame. The same parents who once whispered behind my back now sat in silence, their eyes red, their hands clutching tissues. Even Kurt, the foreman, stood near the front, his hard expression cracked open by guilt and grief. My son stood at the entrance for a long time, frozen by the weight of it all. People began to turn, noticing him. A wave of quiet spread through the room as heads turned toward the door. Whispers followed, soft, cautious, almost reverent. "That's him. That's Ethan's boy. He looks just like his dad." Someone reached out and touched his shoulder. It was the woman from the diner, the one who had worked beside me for years. Her voice trembled as she said, "He'd be so proud of you." He nodded, unable to speak. His throat burned, his eyes stung. Every step toward the front felt heavier, slower. When he reached the stage, the mayor gave a brief speech, words about courage, sacrifice, community. But none of it mattered. The only words that mattered were waiting. In his pocket, the letter I had written before my final shift, sealed in an envelope marked with his name. When it was his turn to speak, the room fell silent. He stood at the podium, the paper trembling in his hands. His voice was quiet at first, but it carried, clear and fragile, like the sound of glass that hadn't yet shattered. My dad, he paused, swallowing hard. My dad wasn't perfect, but he was the best man I've ever known. He worked harder than anyone I've ever seen, not because he wanted money or praise, but because he wanted me to have a life he never got to live. And I didn't understand that until it was too late. The crowd listened, tears already falling. The boy took a shaky breath and opened the envelope. He wrote me this. I think he wanted me to share it. His eyes moved across the page, and then he began to read. My words filled the room. "Son, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't keep my promise the way I wanted to. But I hope you'll understand that I tried. Everything I did, every job, every hour, every scar, was for you. I know you've seen me tired, angry, maybe even broken, but I need you to know that I never regretted a second of it. I wasn't always the best at showing it, but you were the only thing in this world that made life worth it. The day you were born, I promised your mother I'd raise you to be strong, kind, and fearless. I may not be there to finish that promise, but I believe you already are those things. You've always been stronger than me, even when you didn't know it. Don't let the world make you bitter. Don't let their laughter define you. People judge what they don't understand. One day they'll see that the very things they mocked are the same things that make you brave. You don't need to be perfect to be good. You just need to keep trying, even when it hurts. If life ever gets too heavy, remember this. It's okay to rest. You don't have to carry everything alone the way I did. Ask for help. Let people in. And never forget, love isn't always easy or gentle. Sometimes it looks like working through pain. Sometimes it looks like showing up even when you want to give up. That's what I tried to do for you. You were never my burden, son. You were my reason. Love. Dad. By the time he finished, his voice was gone, choked by tears. The gym was silent except for the soft sounds of people crying. The letter hung in the air like a prayer. Kurt stepped forward then, placing a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. Your dad saved my life once, he said quietly. He saved a lot of us in more ways than one. The boy nodded, clutching the letter against his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel the weight of shame pressing down. Instead, there was something else. Something lighter, though it still hurt. Pride. Pain and pride woven together like threads of the same story. After the ceremony, people gathered outside. They laid flowers and candles beneath the photo, some kneeling, some whispering small apologies to the air. The local church announced they were starting a fund in my name, the Ethan Carter Foundation for Working Families. The town that once mocked the man who drove a broken car now honored his name with scholarships, donations, and tears. But my son didn't stay for any of it. He slipped away quietly, walking back home alone as the sun began to set. The world around him had changed, but his heart still felt raw, uncertain. When he reached the apartment, the light spilling through the blinds fell across the table where another envelope waited. One he hadn't opened yet. He hesitated, fingers trembling as he unfolded it. My handwriting greeted him again. Smaller this time, rushed, written the night before my final shift. If you ever need to clear your head, there's a place I want you to go. You'll know it when you see it. It's where your mother and I used to sit when we didn't have much, just dreams and each other. The address is on the back. Go there when you're ready. He turned the page. On the back, an address was scrawled in faded ink, a place miles away, one he didn't recognize. He traced the letters with his finger, feeling something stir inside him. Hope, fear, curiosity. He didn't know what he'd find there. Maybe nothing at all. But the words, "When you're ready," felt like a challenge, a whisper across time, a promise that his father's story wasn't over yet. He folded the letter carefully and looked out the window toward the fading horizon. The world outside was still. Too still. Then, quietly, he said to himself, "I'm ready, Dad." And with that, he packed the letter into his jacket and stepped out the door, following the address that would lead him to the place his father had left behind. My father may have died poor, but he left me richer than anyone I've ever known. The road to the address in the letter stretched far beyond the town where my father had lived and died. It wound through miles of open countryside, where the world felt wider, softer, quieter. The farther I drove, the more it felt as though the noise of everything, the whispers, the pity, the regret, began to fade behind me. All that remained was the sound of tires against gravel and the faint rhythm of my own heartbeat. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I needed to find it. The letter had said I'd recognize it when I saw it, and as the sky opened up to a canvas of gold and pink, I knew I was getting close. The air smelled like pine and rain-soaked earth. It was peaceful, the kind of peace my father had never known in life, but had somehow left for me to discover. The road narrowed into a dirt path that ended at a clearing. There, before me, was an old lake, still and glassy, reflecting the last light of the setting sun. The surface shimmered like it held 1,000 memories just below it, waiting to be touched. On the far side of the lake stood a small wooden bench, weathered but sturdy, facing the water. I knew then that this was the place. I walked slowly toward it, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. Each step felt like a conversation between who I had been and who I was becoming. When I reached the bench, I sat down and let the quiet settle around me. The air was cool, the sky wide open. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand anything, the kind that felt like forgiveness. I imagined my parents here, long before I was born, sitting side by side, their hands intertwined, dreaming about a future that would never come exactly as they'd planned. I could almost hear my mother's laughter carried by the wind, soft and distant. I could see my father's face, younger, less burdened, pointing out across the water, telling her that one day he'd bring their child here. And now, here I was. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the letter again. The creases were deeper now, the ink fading where tears had once fallen. I read it silently, letting every word sink into the rhythm of the wind moving across the lake. If you ever come here, take a deep breath and look around. This is where I learned that life doesn't have to be big to be beautiful. Your mother and I used to come here when we had nothing but each other. We'd sit and dream about a home, a family, a future. We didn't get everything we wanted, but we had enough. I used to think success meant money, a good car, a house that didn't creak in the wind. But I learned something different watching you grow. Real success is when the people you love feel safe when you walk through the door. It's when they know they're loved, even on the days when you have nothing left to give. So when life gets hard, when the world starts laughing again, come here. Sit by the water. Remember that peace doesn't come from what you have. It comes from what you give. When I finished reading, I closed my eyes. The wind moved gently through the trees, brushing against my face like a touch. Soft, familiar. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. The ache in my chest was still there, but it was different now. Less like pain, more like presence. My father wasn't gone. He was here, in every ripple on the lake, every whisper of wind, every heartbeat that reminded me I was still his son. As the years passed, I found myself returning to that lake often. Sometimes I went there to think. Sometimes I went just to sit in silence. It became a place of healing, not only for grief, but for understanding. The lessons my father left behind began to root themselves in me. I worked hard, but not to escape the life we'd lived, to honor it. I finished school, got a job, and little by little, rebuilt the kind of stability he'd always wanted for us. The people in town still remembered his story. The foundation in his name helped dozens of families each year. Single parents trying to make ends meet, working fathers too proud to ask for help, mothers raising children on their own. I made sure of it. As I grew older, the anger I once carried, the guilt, the shame, the endless replay of things I couldn't change, began to soften. I started to see him not as a hero carved from tragedy, but as a man who loved fiercely and quietly, who gave everything he had without ever asking for anything in return. His legacy wasn't the viral story or the memorial or even the foundation. It was me, and the way I lived, the choices I made, the love I carried forward. Years later, when I stood in front of my own child for the first time, I finally understood him in full. The exhaustion, the fear, the pride, the endless ache that comes with loving someone so much that you'd trade your own breath for theirs. I realized then that my father's story wasn't about sacrifice alone. It was about faith, faith that love, even when unnoticed, changes everything it touches. Time moved on, as it always does. The town forgot the headlines, the internet found new stories, and the world turned its attention elsewhere. But the people who had known him, who had seen what he gave, never forgot. And neither did I. Then one day, an invitation arrived in the mail. A letter embossed with the logo of the Ethan Carter Foundation. Inside was a simple note. "We would be honored if you would speak at this year's fundraising event, to share your father's story in your own words." For a long time, I just stared at it. The thought of standing before a crowd, speaking his name, felt impossible. But then I remembered his words. "When life gets hard, when the world starts laughing again, come here." So before the event, I drove out to the lake one last time. The bench was still there, the wood a little more worn but sturdy as ever. I sat down and whispered, "I'm going to tell them, Dad. I'm going to tell them everything." The wind stirred gently across the water, and somehow it felt like he was listening. The night of the event, the auditorium was filled. Faces I didn't recognize turned toward me as I stepped up to the stage. The lights were warm, bright, blinding for a moment. I took a deep breath and looked down at my notes, though I didn't need them. His story was written in me now. Every word, every lesson, every quiet act of love. I cleared my throat, my heart pounding in my chest. The crowd waited. The world seemed to hold its breath. I looked out over the sea of faces, all waiting for me to speak, and said softly, "My father taught me that love doesn't need to be seen to be real." The room fell completely silent, not out of pity, not out of guilt, but out of reverence. And in that silence, I felt him there beside me again, just as he had promised. They laughed at the single dad once, but now his name means strength, love, and sacrifice. Standing on that stage, looking out at a sea of faces, I realized something my father had known all along. The loudest voices are not always the most truthful. Sometimes, the world mocks what it can't understand, only to worship it once it's gone. I adjusted the microphone. The room hushed, and I felt the weight of every memory pressing against my chest. When I spoke, it wasn't with rehearsed words or polished phrasing. It was with the quiet conviction of someone who had lived the story, who had carried its pain and its beauty like twin burdens in the same heart. "My father," I began, "wasn't a rich man. He didn't have a nice house, or a shiny car, or an easy life. In fact, most people thought of him as a failure. The man who couldn't keep up, the dad who always looked too tired, too old, too broken. But what they didn't see was the truth behind those tired eyes. They didn't see what he gave to keep me fed, what he endured to keep me safe." I paused, letting the silence breathe. You could hear every shift in the audience, every heartbeat waiting for what came next. "They laughed at him," I continued softly. "They laughed because he drove an old car, because he didn't fit in, because the world has a cruel way of measuring worth by what you own instead of what you give. But they never saw him at 2 a.m, scrubbing oil off his hands so he could make breakfast before I woke up. They never saw the nights he came home limping, coughing, pretending everything was fine. They never saw the man who gave everything, even his life, to prove that love doesn't need applause." The screen behind me flickered to life. Photos of my father filled the stage. Him at the diner, wearing his name-tagged shirt and a weary smile. Him sitting in our small kitchen, holding a cup of coffee. Him with me, when I was little, our hands covered in paint from fixing the old porch. Each picture was a reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms or stand under spotlights. Sometimes they wear work boots and carry silence instead of pride. "After he died," I said, "the same world that laughed at him suddenly cried for him. They called him a hero, a savior, a symbol. But the truth is, he didn't want to be remembered as a hero. He just wanted to be a father. He wanted to be enough. And he was. More than enough." I took a breath and looked out at the faces. Parents, workers, students, all of them watching with tears in their eyes. "My father taught me that success isn't about how high you climb. It's about how much you lift others while you're climbing. He showed me that love isn't soft or easy. It's painful, it's tiring, it's raw, but it's the only thing that makes life worth living. I could feel the emotion building in my throat, but I didn't fight it. We live in a world that's quick to judge and slow to understand. We scroll past people's struggles like they're just pictures, not realizing that behind every tired face is a story. Behind every broken man, there might be someone who's fighting for someone else. My father taught me to look deeper, to see people, not just their circumstances. The crowd was still. No whispers, no coughs, just the sound of quiet breathing and hearts softening. There's a lesson in his story, I said. It's not just about one man's sacrifice. It's about all the people we overlook. The single parents, the ones working double shifts, the ones eating last so their kids can eat first. It's about learning to see worth where others see weakness. My father used to say, real strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting up again, even when no one's watching. And that's what he did. Every single day. I could see heads nodding in the audience. Some people wiped their eyes. Others simply stared at the screen, lost in their own quiet reflection. When I was a kid, I continued, I was embarrassed by him. I hated how people laughed. I thought love was supposed to look easy. Clean clothes, new cars, smiles that didn't hide pain. But now I know better. Love looks like hands cracked from work. It looks like missed meals and sleepless nights. It looks like a man who keeps going, not because he's strong, but because someone else needs him to be. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, lowering my voice. If my father taught me anything, it's that love isn't loud. It's steady. It's what remains when everything else fades. It's the quiet promise that says, no matter how hard it gets, I won't give up on you. For a long moment, I let the silence fill the room again. You could almost feel him there, in the warmth of the lights, in the stillness, in the heartbeat of every person who suddenly understood what real sacrifice meant. Then I looked down at my notes one last time and smiled faintly. People used to laugh at the single dad who drove the broken car, I said. But now his name stands for strength, love, and sacrifice. Not because he was perfect, but because he kept showing up. Because he chose love over pride. Because he gave everything he had for someone else. I glanced at the photo of him projected behind me. That same tired smile, those eyes that had always seen hope where others saw failure. I thought I lost him, I said softly. But I didn't. He's still here. In every family the foundation helps. In every story that reminds people that love is worth the cost. He's here in me. The audience rose to their feet in silence. Not applause. Reverence. Some were crying openly, others simply standing still, their faces lit by the images of a man they'd never met, but somehow now felt they knew. I took one last deep breath, feeling the weight of every word, every memory, every heartbeat of the man who had built his entire life around love. My father taught me the most important lesson there is, I said, that greatness isn't measured by what the world gives you, but by what you give the world in return. He taught me that real love doesn't demand to be seen. It simply gives and keeps giving, even when it costs everything. I looked up, meeting the crowd's gaze one last time. The room was still, waiting. I let the silence stretch, then whispered the words that ended it all. They mocked him when he lived. Now they teach his story to remind people what love truly costs. The lights dimmed, and for a long, sacred moment, no one moved. Because some stories don't end when a man dies. They begin when the world finally learns what he lived for. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Take a moment to honor every parent who sacrifices in silence. Share this video so their love isn't forgotten. Subscribe for more real stories that remind us what humanity still sounds like. Because sometimes, one story can change how we see the whole world.